After the sudden death of Richard Caldwell, a billionaire businessman who built his empire from the ground up, his company, Caldwell Industries, was left without a clear leader. Richard's younger brother, Leonard Caldwell, stepped in quickly to take control. Leonard wasn't just interested in managing the company. He wanted to own it, to reshape it in his own image. He claimed that Richard had promised him the company would be his after his passing, even though no one had seen any formal documents to support that. Leonard was always known for his bold, ambitious moves, but his rise to power didn't sit well with everyone. Richard's son, Ethan Caldwell, had worked at the company for years, always assuming that one day he would take over when his father retired. Ethan had grown up in the world of business, learning from his father and helping manage the operations of Caldwell Industries. Richard was grooming Ethan to be the future face of the company, and it seemed like a given that Ethan would take the reins when the time came. But after his father's sudden passing, Ethan was completely unprepared for the shock that awaited him. One morning, he arrived at the office to find his uncle already in charge. Leonard had not only assumed control but had begun making changes, restructuring everything from the top down. He had already replaced several key figures in the company with his own hand-picked team, and his first big move was to remove Ethan from his position. Ethan was stunned. He never expected his uncle to act so quickly or so decisively. The company he had worked for his whole life, the company that was meant to be his legacy, was slipping away. Leonard had a lawyer waiting for him when he arrived at the office. He was told, in no uncertain terms, that his presence at the company was no longer needed. Leonard had made it clear that he was now the CEO, and Ethan had no place in Caldwell Industries anymore. The decision was final. For Ethan, it felt like a cruel betrayal. Leonard was not just his uncle, he was family. But in that moment, Ethan realized that family didn't always mean loyalty. The pain of being pushed out of the company, the very heart of his father's legacy, was overwhelming. He stood there, staring at the empty office that once belonged to his father, feeling like he had lost everything in an instant. As he left the building that day, escorted by security, Ethan couldn't help but wonder how his uncle had managed to pull this off. Had his father known this would happen? Was there a plan in place that Richard had never shared with him? Or had Leonard worked behind the scenes, quietly preparing for this moment, while everyone else, including Ethan, was left in the dark? With the company in his hands, Leonard was quick to assert his power. He wasted no time in making changes, bringing in new leadership and cutting ties with anyone loyal to Richard. But despite his efforts to present himself as the rightful heir to the Caldwell empire, the whispers of doubt began to grow. Ethan may have been out of the picture, but something didn't sit right with those who knew the Caldwell family well. The game was far from over, and though Leonard had claimed victory for now, it seemed like there was more to the story than anyone realized. Ethan felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. He spent the following days in a daze, replaying what had happened over and over in his mind. How could Leonard, his own uncle, do this to him? Ethan had grown up admiring his father, Richard, who had always made it clear that one day Ethan would take over the family business. Now, that dream seemed shattered. With no position at the company and no clear plan ahead, Ethan felt lost. He spent his days going over the events that had led to his ousting, trying to find something, anything, that could explain why his uncle would suddenly turn against him like this. But no matter how many times he thought it through, nothing made sense. Everything had been so sudden, so deliberate. It was as though Leonard had been preparing for this moment for years, waiting for the right time to strike. At first, Ethan tried to reach out to Leonard, hoping that they could work things out. Maybe there had been some kind of misunderstanding, he thought. But when he called his uncle's office, the response was always the same. Leonard was too busy to speak with him. Calls and emails went unanswered. It became clear to Ethan that Leonard wasn't interested in discussing anything. He had made his decision, and he was not going to change it. Ethan's frustration grew with each passing day. The company he had spent so many years building alongside his father was now under the control of a man he didn't trust, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't find a way back in. His position at Caldwell Industries wasn't just lost, it was taken from him, and it seemed like there was nothing he could do about it. But Ethan wasn't one to give up easily. He may have been pushed out of the company, but he still had options. He wasn't ready to walk away without a fight. His father had built Caldwell Industries into a powerful corporation, and Ethan knew the company's future was at risk. Leonard, despite his ambitious plans, was not the right person to lead it. Ethan had seen firsthand how his uncle operated. Leonard was more interested in quick gains and personal power than in the long-term success of the business. So Ethan began to gather information. He started talking to former colleagues and board members, asking questions, trying to learn as much as he could about what was really happening inside Caldwell Industries. What he discovered was disturbing. Leonard had begun to make drastic changes, laying off longtime employees, replacing key executives, and cutting corners on some of the company's most important projects. It was clear that Leonard was more focused on making himself appear successful than on keeping the company running smoothly. Ethan realized that if he wanted to take back what was rightfully his, he needed more than just information. He needed evidence. He needed to show the world that Leonard's actions were not just reckless, they were dangerous. And if he could expose the truth, maybe, just maybe, he could convince the board and investors to give him another chance to lead Caldwell Industries. The fight had only just begun, and Ethan was determined to reclaim his father's legacy, no matter the cost. But little did he know, his journey to take back control would be far more complicated and dangerous than he ever imagined. Ethan knew that if he was going to have any chance of taking back control of Caldwell Industries, he needed to act quickly. The more time passed, the more entrenched Leonard became in his position as CEO. Leonard was already making changes, presenting himself as the new face of the company, and Ethan's absence was becoming more and more noticeable. But Ethan was far from ready to give up. If he couldn't rely on the law or his family's word, he would need to find another way, something that could give him the upper hand. Determined to fight back, Ethan hired a well-known lawyer who specialized in corporate law and inheritance disputes. He didn't know how this would play out, but he knew he had to try. The lawyer, Thomas Riley, was experienced and had handled complex family business cases in the past. From their first meeting, Riley seemed confident. "We'll find a way," he assured Ethan, though the situation was far from simple. The first step in the process was to gain access to Richard's will. Ethan had seen firsthand how his father had been involved in running the company. Richard had always planned to pass it down to him. Ethan was certain of it, but the will that had been presented to the public didn't seem to reflect that. Leonard had taken control without any legal questions, and that alone raised a red flag for Ethan. Riley immediately began requesting copies of the will from the law firm that had handled Richard's estate. What they discovered in the coming weeks was both shocking and puzzling. The will that had been submitted to the court was incomplete, lacking the proper signatures from key witnesses that would make it legally binding. Ethan couldn't believe it. His father had always been meticulous about his affairs, so why had this important document been left incomplete? It was as if someone had deliberately left it open to challenge. Riley dug deeper, consulting with estate experts and examining the legal processes behind Richard's will. As he went over the details, he found that the will wasn't just flawed. It had been tampered with. The documents presented by Leonard seemed to have been altered, either by mistake or on purpose. The question on everyone's mind was, who had done it and why? Ethan felt a rush of mixed emotions. On one hand, he was relieved to know that Leonard's takeover wasn't as clear-cut as it seemed. On the other hand, the realization that his father's final wishes might have been manipulated left him feeling betrayed. It didn't make sense. Leonard had always been part of the family, but now it was clear that he was not as trustworthy as Ethan had believed. As Riley worked on gathering more evidence, Ethan continued to investigate on his own. He spoke to employees, both current and former, asking them about any unusual behavior or discussions that might have taken place in the months leading up to Richard's death. It wasn't long before he learned about some unsettling events. A few of the employees mentioned overhearing discussions about a possible transfer of power, but none of them had thought it would happen so soon or under such mysterious circumstances. Ethan began to realize that Leonard might not have just acted out of greed or ambition. There was something deeper at play, something Ethan hadn't considered before. But for now, all he could do was keep gathering information. The legal battle ahead would be long and complicated, and there was no guarantee that he would win. But one thing was certain. Ethan wasn't going to let Leonard get away with stealing his future. As Ethan dug deeper into the mystery surrounding his father's will, the situation became even more complicated than he had imagined. The missing signatures on the will were only the beginning. While his lawyer, Thomas Riley, worked to gather more evidence, Ethan started to piece together a bigger, more unsettling picture. He began to suspect that Leonard's rise to power might not have been as innocent as it appeared. Ethan had always been close to his father, and although their relationship was more business-focused, they shared a bond of trust. Richard had never mentioned anything about his brother taking over the company. But then again, Richard had never mentioned much about his final wishes at all. It was unlike his father to leave things uncertain, which is why Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Leonard had been planning this for longer than anyone realized. As Ethan continued his investigation, he uncovered information that hinted at Leonard's possible involvement in something far more troubling. A few former employees of the company had anonymously reached out to Ethan with strange stories about Leonard's behavior in the months leading up to Richard's death. According to them, Leonard had spent a lot of time with the company's legal team, asking questions about the company's succession plan and how it would be handled if something were to happen to Richard. Some even hinted that Leonard had been pressuring the lawyers for months to ensure that he would inherit the company. But no one had ever expected Richard's death to come so suddenly, and even fewer had expected Leonard to act so quickly and aggressively to claim what he believed was his. The more Ethan learned, the more disturbed he became. Leonard's actions were starting to look less like a simple case of family rivalry and more like a calculated, ruthless power grab. It didn't help that Leonard had been acting strangely in the days following Richard's passing. Several people in the company had noticed how eager Leonard was to push Ethan out of the picture. It seemed like his uncle was more interested in eliminating any potential competition than in leading the company itself. But it wasn't just the will that Ethan needed to question. Ethan began to wonder if Richard's death had been entirely natural. Although there was no definitive proof, there were too many questions left unanswered. Ethan had noticed that his father had been in excellent health in the months before his passing. Richard wasn't the type to suddenly fall ill or make hasty decisions. He had always been methodical, careful, and precise in everything he did. So why had he died so unexpectedly? Ethan couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease, something about the timing of everything. The suddenness of his father's death, Leonard's quick takeover of the company, and the odd behavior surrounding the will, felt wrong. There was a nagging feeling in the back of his mind that something had been orchestrated behind the scenes, but who could he trust to help him uncover the truth? As Ethan struggled to make sense of everything, he realized that this was no longer just a fight for the company. It had become a fight for justice. If Leonard had been involved in any wrongdoing, he would need to be held accountable, no matter how far Ethan had to go to uncover the truth. The deeper he dug, the more dangerous this battle became. Ethan knew that, to win, he would have to be prepared for anything. And with every new revelation, the stakes seemed to rise higher. Ethan knew that the next step in his fight to reclaim Caldwell Industries would be crucial. He couldn't simply rely on the legal team or whispers from employees anymore. If he wanted to get his father's company back, he needed to do something bold. With Leonard now firmly in control and the board largely on his side, Ethan had to think strategically. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. His first move was to gather a group of loyalists. These were people who had worked with Richard for years and had always been committed to the integrity and values that had built the company. Ethan knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed to build an alliance with the people who still believed in what Caldwell Industries stood for. Ethan began meeting in secret with former board members, longtime investors, and senior employees who had been close to his father. He spoke to them one by one, asking for their support and trust. The reaction was mixed. Some were skeptical, unsure if they wanted to get involved in a battle that seemed to have no clear end. Others were eager to help but were worried about the power Leonard had gained in such a short time. Ethan listened carefully, knowing that he had to win their trust and show them that this wasn't just about him. This was about protecting the future of the company Richard had built. The more Ethan spoke to these individuals, the more he began to see a pattern. They all had doubts about Leonard's leadership, even if they hadn't been able to voice them publicly. Ethan heard stories of Leonard's hasty decisions that seemed to prioritize his own gain rather than the long-term health of the company. Several projects had been halted, investments that were meant to drive the company forward were being abandoned, and the morale within the company was rapidly sinking. As Ethan listened to these stories, he realized that Leonard's leadership was unraveling behind the scenes. The company was in danger of losing everything it had worked for, and Leonard didn't seem to understand the long-term consequences of his actions. This gave Ethan a glimmer of hope. If he could prove that Leonard was ruining the company, he might be able to rally enough support to take back control. Ethan also knew that time was running out. Leonard had made it clear that he would not step down, and with each passing day, he became more entrenched in his position. Ethan couldn't just wait for things to get worse. He needed to act before Leonard made any more irreversible changes. It was then that Ethan realized he needed more than just a few allies. He needed a solid public challenge to Leonard's authority. He had to expose the truth, not just to the board and investors, but to the entire company. The public knew Leonard as the new CEO, but they didn't know the full story. Ethan had to show them who Leonard really was, an opportunist who was willing to destroy the very company that Richard had worked so hard to build. Ethan's next move was risky. He would organize a meeting with the board and present all the evidence he had gathered. He planned to reveal the truth about Leonard's shady dealings, the way he had manipulated his way into power, and the damage he was causing to the company. Ethan knew that this was his chance to prove that he was the better leader for Caldwell Industries, and if he could show that Leonard's decisions were putting the company's future at risk, the board might have no choice but to listen. But this wasn't going to be easy. Leonard would fight back with everything he had. Ethan understood that now, more than ever, he needed to be sharp, prepared, and determined. It was no longer just about getting back what was his. It was about saving Caldwell Industries from falling into the hands of someone who was unfit to lead. Ethan was ready to take the next step, knowing that the outcome would determine the future of the company and his own. Ethan's plan was now set in motion, and he was determined to take back control of Caldwell Industries. He had gathered enough evidence to make a compelling case against Leonard, but he knew that getting the board to listen would be the hardest part. Leonard had worked quickly to establish his power, and many members of the board were already loyal to him. But Ethan was confident that if he could expose the truth, they would have no choice but to reconsider their support for Leonard. As the day of the crucial board meeting approached, Ethan grew more anxious. This wasn't just about business, it was personal. This company represented his father's life's work, and it was Ethan's responsibility to ensure that it continued on the right path. But the stakes were high. If Leonard was able to maintain his position as CEO, Ethan feared that Caldwell Industries would be damaged beyond repair. The meeting was held in a sleek, modern conference room in the company's headquarters. Ethan entered the room with a sense of determination. He knew that he had to convince the board not only that Leonard was unfit to lead, but also that he was actively sabotaging the company's future. When Leonard entered the room, he greeted everyone with a confident smile, clearly feeling in control. He had no idea what was coming. Ethan stood up to speak first, calmly laying out the evidence he had gathered over the past few weeks. He started with the discrepancies in the will, how Leonard had manipulated legal documents to position himself as the rightful heir. As Ethan spoke, the room grew quiet. Some of the board members exchanged uncertain glances, but Leonard remained stone-faced, refusing to show any sign of concern. Next, Ethan began to talk about the company's internal struggles under Leonard's leadership. He presented evidence of questionable financial decisions, the abandonment of crucial projects, and the growing tension among employees. Several former employees had already come forward with testimonies about how Leonard had been making reckless decisions that put the company's long-term stability at risk. Ethan could feel the shift in the room. Some board members were clearly surprised by what they were hearing. Leonard, however, continued to defend his actions, trying to downplay the concerns. But then, just as Ethan was about to present his most damning piece of evidence, a whistleblower from within the company stepped forward. It was a senior manager who had been with Caldwell Industries for decades. With shaky hands, the manager handed over a signed confession from one of Leonard's lawyers, admitting that they had deliberately altered the will in Leonard's favor. The room was stunned into silence. This was the proof Ethan needed to show that Leonard's rise to power had been built on lies and manipulation. Leonard's face turned pale as he realized the walls were closing in on him. He tried to speak, but his words were lost in the mounting tension. The board members began to exchange heated whispers, their doubts about Leonard's leadership growing louder. It was clear that Ethan's presentation had shaken them. They had never imagined that things had been so bad behind the scenes. As the meeting drew to a close, Ethan watched as the board members began to question Leonard more directly. They asked him about the financial missteps and his lack of vision for the company's future. Leonard stammered, struggling to defend himself as the evidence continued to pile up against him. The room's energy shifted, and Ethan could see that he was starting to win over the majority. Leonard's grip on Caldwell Industries was slipping away. Finally, the board voted on the matter. Leonard's power had faltered, and the decision was clear. He would no longer be the CEO of Caldwell Industries. With the weight of the evidence against him and the board's lack of confidence in his leadership, Leonard was forced to step down. Ethan felt a rush of relief wash over him. This battle wasn't over, but it was a significant victory. Caldwell Industries was finally freed from the grasp of an unfit leader, and Ethan had secured his place as the rightful heir. But the challenges weren't behind him yet. Leonard wasn't going to go down without a fight, and Ethan knew that this was just the beginning of the long road ahead. The real work was only beginning, but for now, Ethan had won a crucial battle in the war for his father's legacy. The aftermath of the board meeting left Ethan both victorious and vigilant. With Leonard's removal as CEO, Ethan now had control of Caldwell Industries. But it wasn't the end of his battle. Leonard, though defeated in the boardroom, was not one to take this loss quietly. Ethan knew that his uncle would be plotting his next move. The power shift at Caldwell Industries was just the beginning, and Ethan's next steps were critical in securing the future of the company. In the days that followed, Ethan worked tirelessly to stabilize the company. The transition was challenging. Many employees had been loyal to Leonard, and now they were unsure of what the future held. Ethan spent hours meeting with different departments, reassuring them that the company would remain strong under his leadership. He was determined to rebuild the trust that had been lost during Leonard's reckless tenure. He knew it would take time, but he was committed to making Caldwell Industries a company his father would have been proud of. One of Ethan's first priorities was to address the growing concerns about the company's finances. Leonard's quick decisions had put several projects on hold and disrupted important investments. The damage was already done, but Ethan was determined to repair it. He brought in a team of experts to assess the situation and develop a long-term recovery plan. This plan would take time, but Ethan knew it was necessary to restore Caldwell Industries to its former glory. In the meantime, Leonard's absence did not go unnoticed. He had spent years building a network of allies within the business world, and many of them were eager to offer their support. But Leonard was no longer in charge, and his attempts to gather support outside the company were quickly thwarted. Ethan had the backing of the board and the key players in the company, and that was enough to keep Leonard at bay. For now. However, Leonard wasn't the type to accept defeat easily. As days passed, Ethan began to receive subtle threats. It started with phone calls late at night, then anonymous letters warning him to step aside and let Leonard reclaim his position. Ethan knew Leonard wouldn't let go of Caldwell Industries without a fight. But Ethan also knew that the truth was on his side. Leonard's manipulation of the will and his damaging decisions at the company were things that couldn't be ignored. Despite the pressure mounting on him, Ethan stayed focused. He reminded himself of his father's vision for Caldwell Industries and the responsibility he had to ensure it thrived. With the company's future now in his hands, Ethan began to make bold decisions, aiming to lead Caldwell Industries into a new era. He focused on innovation and sustainability, encouraging his team to think outside the box and embrace new technologies that could propel the company forward. But even with all of Ethan's efforts to move the company in the right direction, Leonard's influence still loomed large. As Ethan continued his work, he realized that he couldn't simply wait for Leonard to make his next move. He had to act. The situation required Ethan to be proactive, to not only rebuild Caldwell Industries, but to protect it from any further threats that Leonard might pose. As Ethan prepared to face whatever came next, he knew that the battle for Caldwell Industries was far from over. Leonard would continue to challenge him, and the journey to secure the company's legacy would be filled with more obstacles. But one thing was certain. Ethan was ready. He had faced setbacks before, and each time he had come back stronger. Now, with the truth on his side and his father's legacy at stake, Ethan knew that nothing could stop him from ensuring Caldwell Industries would flourish once again. The months following Leonard's removal as CEO were both a period of recovery and growing tension for Ethan. While Caldwell Industries slowly began to heal from the damage caused by his uncle's leadership, the shadows of Leonard's influence still hung over the company. Leonard was not the type to accept defeat. He still had allies in powerful places, and he wasn't about to walk away quietly. Ethan knew that he had won the battle, but the war was far from over. Ethan kept his focus on the business, ensuring that the company remained steady and that morale within the organization improved. He met with key team members and made bold decisions that began to show positive results. The recovery plan for the company started to take shape, and employees began to see that Ethan had a clear vision for the future. But Leonard didn't give up. One day, Ethan received an unexpected visit from an old business associate of his uncle's. This man, a former board member, had come to warn Ethan. Leonard had been meeting with influential investors, trying to rally support for a return to power. The whispers of Leonard's campaign to regain control were growing louder, and Ethan had to prepare for what was coming next. Ethan wasn't shocked by the news, but he knew this would be a defining moment. Leonard had already shown he would stop at nothing to claim back what he believed was his. Ethan had to find a way to end this once and for all, to prove that Leonard's actions had consequences and that Caldwell Industries was not a company to be toyed with. As the battle for the company reached its peak, Ethan began to take strategic steps to secure his position. He reached out to influential figures in the business world, creating partnerships that would not only strengthen Caldwell Industries, but also make it clear that he had the support and backing to lead. He also made sure that Leonard's influence within the company would no longer be tolerated. He worked closely with his team to implement new policies that promoted transparency and accountability, making it harder for anyone, including Leonard, to manipulate the system again. However, despite all his efforts, Leonard's campaign for a comeback continued to gain traction. One morning, as Ethan was reviewing company reports, he received an anonymous tip. Someone had leaked sensitive information to the press, suggesting that Ethan's leadership was damaging the company's reputation. The rumors quickly spread, and soon, media outlets were questioning Ethan's ability to lead Caldwell Industries. Ethan felt the pressure mounting, but instead of succumbing to it, he saw it as an opportunity to prove his strength. He knew that if he stayed calm, focused, and transparent, the truth would prevail. He immediately called a press conference to address the situation head-on. With confidence, he spoke to the media, explaining the measures he had taken to restore the company and revealing the lies Leonard had been spreading. The public began to rally behind Ethan, and the board members who had been on the fence began to see that he was the leader Caldwell Industries needed. After the press conference, the tides began to turn. Leonard's attempts to undermine Ethan fell apart as the evidence against his manipulation and deceit became more obvious. The support for Leonard began to dwindle, and Ethan's leadership was solidified. The board, investors, and employees recognized that Ethan had not only taken control of Caldwell Industries, but had done so with integrity and vision. In the end, Leonard's campaign failed. He found himself isolated, with no allies left to turn to. Ethan had proven that not only was he the rightful leader of Caldwell Industries, but he had also shown the strength to protect it from any threat. Leonard's role in the company was effectively erased, and Ethan emerged victorious, not just as the CEO, but as the true heir to the Caldwell legacy. Looking back, Ethan knew that the journey had been tough. It wasn't just about reclaiming the company. It was about proving to himself and everyone around him that integrity, loyalty, and hard work would always triumph over deceit and manipulation. Caldwell Industries was now on a clear path toward success, and Ethan felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. He had saved his father's legacy, and in doing so, had become the leader he had always hoped to be.